Hi, I'm Janet Reynolds. Thanks for joining us in this What's Up. Oh, no, it's not What's Up Wednesday. That's another thing I do. Perfect intro. Right on Wednesdays with Mental Health Connecticut. I am super excited to be talking today with Matthew Dix, who has agreed to talk with us about the power of storytelling. I've interviewed Matthew once before for an article for a magazine, and he has only gone on since then to write, yes, more books, more things, more talking. He's an international book author. He's a podcaster. He is a Moth champion storyteller multiple times. I think I looked at his website 42 times, and a 6-time Grand Slam Moth champion. Which if you haven't checked out The Moth, you should. It's wonderful, wonderful storytelling. He is also the founder of Speak Up, which is a storytelling organization based in Hartford, but that works around New England and perhaps around the country. And he is, no kidding, an elementary school teacher in West Hartford. So welcome, Matthew. Thank you for talking. If I missed any of those things, or if you want to learn more, MatthewDix.com is the place to go. You can sign up for, he's got an email, he does regular blogging, I don't know. I thought there were 24 hours in a day. Apparently I was wrong.
No, there's just 24. You just have to use them really effectively.
Yeah, well, you are obviously super good at that, just based on, what I know of your work. I, by the way, use a couple of your stories in my Write On class that I teach because it helps to sort of set the scene for everybody about why was this a good story? Like what worked around it? And so it's fun to be able to do this with you here.
That's great.
So we're going to specifically sort of talk about the power of storytelling and how it can be cathartic and useful in just about anybody's life, I think. But I'm going to start a little bit with asking you to talk about, you've had a variety of traumatic events in your life, and I want you to sort of outline those for us, but also realize or talk about when you realize that stories or storytelling might be a way to kind of work your way through some things.
Sure. Yeah, I've had one of those sort of unusual lives, we'll say. I always feel blessed. So I always say, there's been some trauma in my life, but I have always felt that I'm a very fortunate person. However, I'm a person who, I grew up in a very challenging circumstance with a really difficult, a dreadful stepfather and an absent mother and poverty and a mess. My childhood was kind of a mess, although I'll tell you I had a wonderful time throughout the struggle. Twice in my life, I have stopped breathing and my heart has stopped beating. Paramedics have had to bring me back to life both times. I was arrested and tried for a crime I didn't commit. I spent time in jail. I was homeless for a period in my life. I was the victim of an armed robbery that left me with 15 years of untreated PTSD and now a lifetime of constantly treated PTSD. So that's sort of like the tip of the iceberg of nonsense that I have had to deal with in my life.
Yeah, I think one of those would have been enough, but that's a long list, right?
It is. I know, that's what my therapist says. That's quite a list. But, I feel I'm very blessed. I truly feel like I'm a fortunate person despite all of those things. Mm-hmm. In terms of storytelling and how it's sort of helped me, I think really early on in my life, to be honest with you, I started doing it, not in a conscious way, mm-hmm. Not in a storytelling is going to help me way, but very early on, even, in middle school and high school, I discovered that one of the ways that I could sort of, get attention through storytelling, but also sort of like package things. That's the way I used to think of it. I would package something in a story. And then once I had packaged it in a story, I could sort of put it away. I could sort of put it on the shelf. Mm-hmm. So, something would happen in my childhood, some terrible thing involving my stepfather. And I would be in my unheated basement room trying to sleep it off. And the best way I found to sort of move past that thing would be to go to school the next day and pull a couple of my friends aside and tell them what happened in a story fashion, in sort of a beginning, middle, and end, entertaining way. I would genuinely try to tell it in a way that wasn't a woe is me, but sort of hey, let me tell you this crazy thing that happened and talk to you about how I came out on the other side. And then in doing that, I found the ability to sort of move past these things. And later on, you know, I discovered that it's more than just sort of packaging it and putting on a shelf. It's the idea that I am taking something difficult from my life. I am making meaning and art in a way out of it. Now that's the way I feel about it when I'm crafting stories from my life, whether it's a traumatic event or not. You know, I'm trying to create art from something in my life that once was not artful. You know, I also think about it in terms of putting chapters into my life, which I think is really important for a lot of people.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, right. Go on. Yeah.
I think a lot of people see their life, you know, like I could easily see my life as a continual, you know, series of disasters. And for a long time, that really was the way it was. Every time I thought I had clawed back to even, I would get arrested, or I'd end up homeless, or I'd end up robbed, you know, all of these disasters would happen. But the way I thought about my life and storytelling is that was a chapter in my life that had a beginning and an end. And I got to bring an end to it, you know? So, for example, when I was homeless, I became homeless because no one helped me, because parents and relatives and friends who should have really stepped up and done something for me when I was 22 years old and had no one to turn to, no one stepped up. And for me, for a very, very long time, even though my homelessness lasted, you know, all of 6 weeks, you know, I thought it was the rest of my life at the time. It lasted 6 weeks, but the idea that no one helped me and no one wanted to help me, that affected me for a very long time. And then one day I decided to talk about it, and I crafted it into a story. And the lingering pain of having no one in your life to help you, you know, that had sort of festered throughout my entire life. As soon as I crafted it into a story, created art and entertainment, and developed some understanding of myself and the situation, that was it. It was like the pain existed and it was real, but now it has a place in my life, a chapter in my life, and now I'm in a new chapter, and I don't need to allow that pain to continue to infect the rest of my life. All of those things happened when I started telling stories.
Right. And I think you can also, one of the things that I think is part of what you're discussing, but it's something is, I think you can also rewrite stories. And in a sense, you're talking about that on some levels, not because you necessarily are changing the facts of what happened, which were terrible and, you know, impactful, but you're rewriting sort of their ability to hold on to you or hold you in one place. And I also think that sometimes you can use a story to rewrite an ending, and even though that's not the ending that happened, I think it can help you have a stronger faith in yourself depending on what the moment is. So yeah, that's great.
I think those endings are interesting, because I think quite often, if you're not a storyteller and you're not reflective about your life, the ending that you often think of is the most painful ending. It's the low point that you often think of as the ending. But as a storyteller, what I'm always thinking about is the idea of, I was once one person or one kind of person, and then some stuff happened and I became a different kind of person. And when you frame it like that, that low point doesn't end up being the ending anymore. You end up looking past the low point to the thing that you can take from it. You know, whether it's a small, tiny little thing that you can take from it, you know, you took one infinitesimal step forward, that is good enough for an ending for me. So changing the ending of your story, I always tell storytellers, you get to pick where you stop your story.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, don't stop it in the gutter, like climb out of the gutter and then bring your story to an end. And then that incident, it reframes it in your mind as something that isn't so terrible after all, because something came of it.
Right. I think you can also take a story, and if you recognize that this is the story I'm doing now, you can also go back and change it again. In other words, you've developed further. You know, at a certain point, taking a traumatic event, for example, you can only go so far in that story and the discovery. 10 years though, you can tell the story in another way or add an additional details that only help to make you even more of the hero, if you will.
Yes. So a great example is I was in an armed robbery. A man put a gun to my head, told me he was going to kill me, and then pulled the trigger. Now, there was no bullet in the gun at the time. but I believed there was. And the fact I could actually say that sentence to you is extraordinary. That is many, many years of therapy that allows me to actually speak of that in any way whatsoever. But when I was sitting in the therapist's office, the story that I would tell, the story he eventually, after 2 years, got me to tell, was what happened that night to me. And I had to tell that story over and over and over again, speaking about what happened to me that night. 5 years later, when I went to tell that story on a stage, it was not a story about what happened that night. That was the center of the story. But the beginning of the story is the fact that I have beautiful children who do terrible magic shows and make me laugh all the time. And the end of the story becomes the continuation of my family. And that middle of the story is how that robbery and everything that's happened has informed my family life and the way I perceive my children and my wife and my days. And so you're right, that the story originally began as, here's a terrible thing that happened to me. And now it's expanded into something much more meaningful, palatable. It's more entertaining, it's more artful, and I'm able to get more from it than just grinding through the pain until it's not affecting me so much.
Right. And sometimes I think it's the repeating of the challenging story, which you told for 5 years or whatever, that ultimately enables you to get to the place of the other story, the rewriting or the reframing the story in the event.
Yes. Sometimes just telling yourself the story causes you to suddenly realize what you couldn't see. You know, I often tell storytellers, we tell our stories in our heads, you know, which is really to say we're not really telling our stories in our heads. We're just kind of thinking about them. But when you actually go through the process of physically speaking the words out loud about what has happened to you, I believe there's a process where you get to hear what has happened to you for the first time in a way that doesn't exist inside your brain. And so often I have been telling myself a story in the shower or behind the wheel of my car, thinking it was a story about one thing. And when I'm done, I go, oh my God, I can't believe it. And I rush home and tell my wife and say, that's not a story about this. Did you know this? And oftentimes, sadly, my wife says, yes, I've known that for a long time, Matt.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, sometimes we're the last people to figure things out.
So often. So often. Yes.
Well, and I also think, I wonder what you think about this, but I do think there is something to that repetition too, in terms of how the strength and power that a story can have for you personally. I have a story that I've told a number of times in my teaching, and when I'm talking about Right On, about being a young child and being tall and chubby, and getting the nickname Janet the Planet, which informed my sort of thoughts around myself for decades, and informed all kinds of eating behaviors, etc. And then I had a moment where I realized, wow, I don't actually have to block. That's not my story. Like, that is my story, but that isn't necessarily who I am in my, and it was lots of repetition and sort of in funny ways and, all of those things. Right.
Yeah. For me, it's in the crafting process that happens. The tricky part is, because I'm also a storyteller who performs on stage, it's that careful line of, I still need my story to impact me when I'm on stage. And so I don't want to ever tell it so often that it just becomes sort of rote, that it's just words that I speak. I see that happen to storytellers where they've just locked it in, they've memorized it, and now it's just words they say. So for me, when I'm telling a story, I'm always re-inhabiting that space. But the joyous thing is when that happens, quite often, even when I'm standing on stage, I'll return to that time and that space, and I'll see things, for things I've completely forgotten, that because I've now opened up that world again, I see different things. And sometimes they're irrelevant details, sometimes they're interesting details, but sometimes they're genuine revelations about things that happened in the time that you can find through that repetition.
And I think also, I'm sure you see this when you tell your story, and it's maybe a story you've told before or whatever, the audience reaction to it also affirms and sends like vibes towards you in that healing or whatever creative process. What do you think?
I think that is an incredible part of storytelling. It is the part that has surprised me the most. 5 times in my life, I have stepped off a stage and I've had a woman come up to me, and 5 times the woman has come up to me and told me the story of her miscarriage. And all 5 times I was the only person she had ever spoken about regarding her miscarriage. And it wasn't even a story that I had told involving miscarriages in any way. I had just spoken vulnerably about myself. You know,
Mhm.
and the first time it happened, I was in New York. I'll never forget it. I ran out of the theater. I got into the car. I called my wife and I said, "You're not going to believe what just happened." And she said to me, "That makes total sense." You know, she had a miscarriage once in her life. And she said, oftentimes people don't even know you were pregnant when you have your miscarriage, which makes it a really challenging conversation. I
Right.
was pregnant and now I'm not. That's a weird thing to have to say to people.
Right.
And you assign blame to yourself, even though we know you should not blame yourself. It's just automatic. She said, you stood on a stage, you were vulnerable. She said, the other important thing is they didn't have to see you the next day. Sometimes it's nice to find someone who you can trust, who you can speak something to that you know you don't have to look at in the cubicle the next day. So for all those reasons, and I can't tell you how many times I have told a story and someone has shared a secret with me, a secret they've never told anyone before. I had a woman recently come up to me and she pulled me in really close. Like, people are always touching me after I tell a story. They just, for whatever reason, they just feel like they know me in a way I don't even know them. But she pulled me in close and she said, without even introducing herself, she said, every time I go into someone's home, even my own mother's home, I have to steal something. And then she pulled me really close and she whisper yelled at me. She went, I've never told anyone that before. You know, and I know I didn't cure her mental illness that night. I suggested there might be other people to speak to than myself, but I also know the value of sort of unburdening yourself of a secret, you know, the weight that a secret can carry all your life. And then to have someone there who you feel like, I can tell that person this thing that I've never told anyone else before. I think that's powerful. I once had a kid in a high school come up to me after I performed, and he told me, I pee in the corner of the bathroom. I can't use the toilet. And then he ran away. He just ran away from me. But again, it was a thing that he had that he needed to tell someone. He wasn't ready to like ask for help, but he was ready to at least say something to someone. That happens to me all the time.
Which is the first step for people. I mean, is just the secret, or the, you know, the whisper or the admission is the first step toward, you know, their sort of being able to look at their story.
Yes.
You know, and so, you know, if you take that young man in the bathroom, I mean, he can sort of be looking at that and sort of and tell a story around it, and then start to get to where that's, you know, why is that, and
Yeah.
and how of it, or whatever.
Right.
And I think also with stories, you're telling the truth, but the way the words you choose, as with everything, also, you know, impact the exact accuracy of how it's told. And I think that can be something that can be useful as a tactic as well.
Yes. I always say we tell the truth, but we don't tell the whole truth. You know,
Right.
so I've never added anything into a story that has never actually happened to me. But, you know, for many reasons, people get removed from stories, you know, some third wheel who doesn't play a role in a story. A lot of times when you clear out the things that are irrelevant to the story, you know, when you start to recognize the things that don't matter, the things that do matter show up with such clarity. And like what actually happened to you and how it actually impacted you is sometimes not obvious until you get rid of the guy who was half naked that night, or the, you know,
Right.
the drunk girl, or the car accident, right? Well, we had a car accident that night. And I say to people like, I know, but that's not actually what's important. I understand that you did get in a car accident that night, but the reason you're telling me the story has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that like your mother said a terrible thing to you and it's still bothering you to this day. That is the story you should be telling. And she said like, how can I leave a car accident out of the story? And I said, that's a different story. Right now, let's just focus in on your mother. She wasn't able to focus in on her mother. This is a recent one, because other things were just sort of cluttering the evening for her instead of recognizing the thing that she really wanted to say. And once we got rid of the car accident, she started crying about her mother. And I knew, oh, here's the story. You know,
Right.
once people start crying, I know they found the story.
Right.
That
Right.
doesn't mean you have to cry, though. I don't want people to think they have to weep every time they find the story, but sometimes it's a good thing.
Yes. Well, and there are plenty of funny stories too.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
so I'm wondering if, you know, there are two parts to storytelling. One is the writing of it, and then the other is the sharing of it. And I think they can serve different functions. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, because you write prolifically. Like, not everything you do is verbal. You
Right.
know?
Yes. Although I'll tell you, when it comes to storytelling, what I like to free people up from is the idea they actually have to write their stories out word for word. I've never done that in my life. Now, I'm unusual. I've never actually written a single word of any story that I've ever performed on stage. I do everything orally. I've never met anyone who does it exactly like that. But what I do tell people is that rather than writing stories word for word, try to just write stories in terms of outlines. The best stories are not stories that are memorized. Those are monologists. And it is hard to feel like someone is being vulnerable and authentic with you if they have memorized lines. You know, essentially you're an actor playing yourself in that case.
It's like reading a PowerPoint.
Yes, exactly. So instead, what I say is I remember my stories. So I create sort of a chain of events in my head, and each link is a scene. So like I started here and some stuff is going to happen, and then I moved to here and some stuff happened. So I think of stories in that way. And most of the storytellers who I work with and most of the professionals who I know, they're not a word for word situation. And I think that frees up people quite a bit, because oftentimes when we write word for word, we're writing for the page and not for the spoken, not spoken. Well, if you were to read my novel out loud, it would not sound like me, because every sentence is sort of a complete sentence, and we don't speak in complete sentences. I'm probably right now in the midst of a poorly written run-on sentence that is carrying on and on, that on the page would look horrible, but right now you can't even tell that I'm still in the middle of the sentence that I began referring to 30 seconds ago.
Right.
So getting out of that word for word often frees up people quite a bit to tell their stories more often and to recognize them as not being so weighty and important. Like, just to speak your truth is a really important thing.
Right.
So however you find your way, I think that ultimately you're going to, in the best form, you're going to try to remember your story rather than memorize your story. There's something I call the dinner test, which is if I'm standing on stage and I'm telling a story, it should be a close approximation to the story I would tell if you and I were having dinner. So if you were having dinner with me and it felt like I was telling you a memorized story that I had prepared for you ahead of the dinner, you would never have dinner with me again. That would be a weird thing. And so I want my stories to sound as natural as possible in that way. So
Right.
you can just tell your story out loud. I think that's a beautiful thing too.
Yeah. I do want to talk a little bit about the writing, the craft of writing, though, too, since that's a critical part. So, you're a prolific writer, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about your writing practice, if you will. I mean, other than I feel like you must always have a pen in your hand and just, in a free moment, you're writing something. But, and also as part of that, I want you to just talk a little bit about homework for life, because a lot of times people say, I don't know what to write about. So therefore they just don't get going. So those two things, please.
Sure. It is true. I always have a pen in my hand, or really a computer at hand. When people ask me, how do I manage to write so much? Or, when do you write? I tell people I write in the cracks of my life. And so that means, I'm up early in the morning, admittedly, and I get a good hour or two in the morning to myself. And, that means I'm going to write a blog post first, because that's going to warm me up for writing, and then probably something else. But I think one of the things that people struggle with is the idea that 5 minutes is a valuable bit of time. And I've always felt that 5 minutes is extremely valuable. So, if my son is working on his learning assignment and my wife doesn't need my help, and I go, oh, I got 15 minutes here, I write for 15 minutes. And that might mean I'm going to write 10 more sentences in the novel I'm working on, or it might mean I'm going to revise the last 10 sentences that I wrote in the novel I'm working on, or I'm going to begin tomorrow's blog post, or I write columns for magazines. I'll start a column. A lot of times people think of that writing process as a precious thing. I've met people who say, well, I can only write in Starbucks, if I have a latte and 2 hours. And I say, well, isn't that unfortunate? I remind them that during World War I, people were writing novels in the trenches while wearing gas masks and as bombs were flying over their heads. And you're telling me that you have to have a Starbucks coffee? Like, boy, if you had been born 30 years ago, you wouldn't be a writer, because Starbucks did not exist. Like, I don't think that's a real thing. So, I think the idea that we have to view all time as precious, and that any crack that we have in our life, any moment, whether it's an hour or 5 minutes, or it's a Saturday, like, just write. In terms of not knowing what to write, homework for life plays a big role, and I'll talk about it in just one sec. But the other thing I like to remind people is I've never in my life had writer's block, not for 1 second. And I always think the people who have writer's block, they're not working on enough projects. You know, I don't know a single professional writer who is working on one thing. You know, so if I'm working on my book and I'm sort of stuck, I have another book that I'm working on, you know, the next book, or I'm working on a column or a blog post, or I'm working on a musical with a friend, or the secret book I'm not telling anyone about that I think is terrible, but I want to keep working on. You know, I think you need to be working on a lot of things if you're getting stuck. But Homework for Life has been enormous for me. It's the process that I began, God, about 8 years ago now, just the desperate attempt to stay on stages and tell stories. I began asking myself this question every day, a homework assignment I gave to myself. I said, what is the most story-worthy moment from my day? Essentially, if I had to tell a story about something that happened today, as boring and banal as it might be, what is the one thing from today that is most interesting, even if it's really not interesting overall? And then I write it down. I don't write the whole thing down because I think that's crazy. I don't think anyone would do it. What I do is I use an Excel spreadsheet, and I just write enough sentences down across the column to recapture that moment. My goal was to get one new story every month. That would have been fantastic. What happened instead, and what's happened for thousands of people, is if you engage in this process over time, you develop a lens for storytelling. You suddenly see that your life is filled with things to talk about and write about. Little moments and big moments and everything in between, just these moments of realization and transformation, these moments when someone says something to you and your heart skips a beat, or you look out the window and you see something you've never seen before, and you recognize, I can write about that, or I can speak about that. So all of those little moments now become writing topics and projects for me that I use all the time. And it's just the awareness and the acknowledgement that no matter who you are, your life is filled with stories. And the only problem is you're not seeing them yet. And you have to engage in a process to begin seeing them better. I have a TED Talk on the subject. If they just Google the words Homework for Life, they can listen to me speak to it for about 17 minutes and really go through the process in detail.
Yes, right. And also just to, I encourage people to do that. I've watched that. Also, when you say you don't have to write a lot, you're not kidding. You're using an Excel spreadsheet.
Yes, I stretch it across the screen.
Right.
And then the only spot that I write in now, ultimately every day usually has many more than one item now. That was not the case in the beginning. In the beginning, I was struggling to find anything and feeling terrible about myself. But over the course of time, I just started to see things all over the place. And I'm not the only one. I'm not special in any way. If people do it for 100 days in a row, I ask them to email me and I send them something back as a congratulations. And thousands of people all over the world have emailed me. If we opened my inbox right now, I promise you there's at least one email that I've received already today from someone who has hit 100 days. And it's never, I hit 100 days, it was a waste of time. It is always, I've hit 100 days. I can't believe how I see my life now in a way I never saw it before.
Right. And, you know, in these challenging times, that's probably a good, even more relevant than ever, because it can get easy to get stuck in the sort of like vortex of what's going on and none of it's good.
Well, now is the best time. And I've had many people tell me that they're finding more moments now than ever before, which seems counterintuitive because we're actually doing less. We're seeing fewer people. Our lives are more static. But what's happening is because of the world we live in, our brains are working and we are recontextualizing our lives and the way we look at people and the way we view our work and our leisure. And we're just having more moments of self-discovery, which is essentially what I'm writing about all the time. Whether I've interacted with someone and discovered something about myself or the world, or I've seen something out in the world, you know, this change in the world has caused us to do a lot of thinking, and that produces a lot of stories.
Right, exactly. And that to me seems like a perfect place to start. Thank you so much for talking with us about the power of storytelling. I know you're working on a book, something about that,
I am.
and 900 other projects.
Yeah.
Thanks for all you do to help people learn how to tell their stories.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, see ya. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yep.